Day, and welcome to today's Association for Learning Environments webinar, Designed for Safe and Healthy Children, a study of best practices for school safety, mental health, and wellness. We have a great panel for you today. We are going to be hearing from Robert Bell and Ann Nierenmuir from Perkins Eastman, and also Andrea Swiatoka, who is the Deputy Chief of Facilities for DC Public Schools. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's program, and now I'm going to turn the call over to our speakers.
Great. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you very much for joining us. It looks like it's a pretty good turnout. You all know that this is, of course, earns you learning units with the A4LE. It also is a health, safety, and welfare credit with the AIA. And our learning objectives for today include understanding the key factors that contribute to school safety, and we mean that in a holistic way. We will be discussing how various features related to hardening or softening schools relates to child development, mental health, and well-being. We'll also be analyzing similarities and differences of the perceived threats and the design responses that schools often take on. In this case, we've got some survey information from suburban and rural schools. We are working on our urban component to that. And we'll also explore how we as designers, as educators, and even as community members can collaborate to create safe and welcoming environments for students. Before we get started, I do want to ask, we have a little poll, I believe, that'll be available. I don't know if it pops up on your screen or if it's off to the side. But of all of you that are participating today, how many of you are architects or designers? I can see people are already filling it in. School administrators, engineers, or other. We'd love to see a great balance, and it looks like we've got about half the people polling in right now, and it is substantially architects and designers, and that's great. We've got a fair showing of other, which I wish we could engage everybody and find out what other is. I know there are many different design professionals. Certainly a topic that touches us all. It touches us as parents, as individuals, as community members, as working professionals. So it's good to see. It sounds like we've got mostly architects, but a fair showing of others. I think the session that we have today, we're going to break it into 3 parts. So we're going to start off and we're going to talk about a little bit of background. We're going to sort of set the stage and give some context on safety and security. Ann will be providing that. We'll also then look at the data and statistics. So we've done a lot of literature review. We've done a look into some studies. We've done our own analysis and surveys. So we'll share that with you. So we'll see what's actually happening. And then what we really want to focus on is a balanced approach. With all this information that we're going to share, what we really want is a reset button and to talk about how we can all contribute as designers, as districts, and as communities. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Ann, and she'll get us started on a little bit of background.
Thanks, Bob. As we started this study, we felt like so much of the media focus and everything we hear about school safety is really focused specifically on school shootings. And it's true that over the last 20 years, more than 220,000 kids have experienced some kind of gun violence at their school. So each time this happens, there's sustained media coverage about the incident. And while we have seen some of the nuances of that coverage change a little bit in recent years, much of it is really still focused on how to make schools harder targets and keep intruders out. And I think our team really wants to sort of challenge that because the issue is far more complex. So living and working in Washington, D.C., I've been designing schools here for about 15 years. And like a lot of other cities around the country, we have our share of challenged neighborhoods and fortress-like public buildings. Unfortunately, many of those fortresses are schools. So one of these photos is of a detention center and one is of a DC public high school. So when I hear about hardening schools in the media, what it brings to mind for me are these prison-like school buildings that we in DC have worked so hard over the last decade and a half to eliminate or transform. These schools had cages on the windows. They had no windows sometimes. They had concrete barriers around the site, heavily locked entrances. And theoretically, this was to protect the school, but I think that we really have to consider what it does to the children that enter that environment every day throughout their childhood. I don't think it's a positive impact. So this school, which is the image on the left here, was actually referred to as a prison by the families in this neighborhood. There were significant issues with crime inside the school, in large part fostered by this hardened building that totally eliminated transparency and discouraged visibility and communication among the community there. So these hardened and fortress-like schools are often very chaotic, and that can make social challenges even more problematic for kids. The opposite is really what we should be striving for. So the image on the left is the same school that you saw in the previous photo. This is Dunbar Senior High School. And in 2012 and 13, this was demolished, and the building on the right was reconstructed on the same site. And you can see that it's got a lot of wonderful civic presence, a lot of glass, and a very welcoming entrance, that really invokes pride for this community, not just for the students and the teachers inside the school, but also the whole neighborhood. So I think, as designers, as many of us on the call are working in this field, we automatically sort of know that that building on the right feels like a better environment. But the important thing is that there's actually a lot of research, and I know there are people out there in the communities that might see that and say, yeah, it looks nice, but what about all that glass? So there's actually a huge amount of research available that explores how these positive environments can support children's development, and also research showing us how detrimental the hardening can be on kids' ability to learn and to thrive, and that these more open and, yes, more glassy environments really do improve safety on many levels. So our communities, as we started this project, we felt like one of the things that communities are lacking are understandable metrics and a really tangible language to speak about the issues. So we need better ways to talk about our fears and our hopes regarding school environments, about safety, about fear, about mental health, so that we can really have meaningful conversations that lead to real solutions instead of reactionary debates. So our hypothesis is that children learn best when they feel safe. So what does that really mean? That's what we've been trying to study and figure out and engage. How do we as designers engage with school administrators, with local governments, with communities to help create positive, healthy, and safe school environments? So of course, with any project relating to a school, the student is really a key focus and our primary focus as we start out. So I wanted to sort of start our conversation here about understanding their perspective. There's a group called Whole Child Education, and they put a challenge to us in this way, which I think is really useful. Each child in each school, in each of our communities, deserves to be healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged. And we all know, of course, that kids don't come to our schools as blank slates. They bring with them a multitude of experiences and ideas and struggles. So it's really important for us to understand what it is that we're asking teachers and administrators to address each day in the school building. So one key finding is that whole child development requires the integration of cognitive, social, and emotional processes. So historically, cognition and emotion have been thought of separately, but they're inextricably linked. We can't address one without the other. So most school shooters are current or former students. The median age is just 16 years old, and they're kids who felt neglected, felt worthless, felt outcast. So while school shootings are horrific, we can't forget that a lot of other types of incidents occur on campuses every day. Things like bullying and fights, sexual abuse. And when we talk about school safety and we're trying to solve for school safety, we have to solve for all of those issues so that they don't escalate to the worst case scenario. spring relabeled these as frightening or threatening, which is maybe a little bit easier to speak to. So exposure to these stressors in childhood is associated with large increases for heart disease, cancer, even Alzheimer's disease. So of these 10 ACEs, 2/3 of the population have experienced at least one, and 13% have experienced 4 or more. So that percentage is not evenly distributed. It does tend to be concentrated in urban areas as well as other places with high poverty populations. So I think it's just important that we keep in mind what children are bringing to the school and the really significant impact that can have lifelong on them if we're not able to address it at an early age. So a lack of connection is also one of the root causes of anxiety and depression. So these are some of the types of disconnection that people can experience or feel. There's several books and a number of other research articles that we found relating to this, and these were sort of 4 that rose to the top. So one that's pretty obvious is disconnection from other people and just, not feeling a part of community. We are social beings. Disconnection from nature. So we know that direct exposure to nature is essential for both physical and emotional health. Also improves your cognitive abilities and your resilience to stress. Disconnection from status or respect. So we can think about that in terms of, with students, in terms of low expectations. So how do we show students that we care about them, that we expect them to succeed, that we believe that they can succeed? And disconnection from hope for a secure future. So how are we helping students understand that there is something for them in the next step, that it's not just getting through school because your parents told you had to or because the government says you have to, but what happens after that point, and that they're members of community and of society, and that they're citizens that can, or not, that can, be meaningful members of their community, and that we do have those expectations for them. So what's important is sort of thinking about the human relationship, and that is the primary process where all these factors reinforce each other. So how can we help schools build these connections? How can we help schools encourage stronger personal relationships? So I'm going to dig in a little bit more to help us understand further what this stress and what this loss of connection is doing inside our bodies. So imagine for a moment that you encounter an angry grizzly bear. I'm just going to pause for a moment and really, close your eyes if you want. Put yourself in that situation. How is your body reacting and feeling? So when you see that bear, your body actually reacts immediately, right? It floods your system with adrenaline, with cortisol, your pupils dilate, your heart races, and you are ready to either fight or run from that bear. That really basic instinct of fight or flight kicks in right away. So what's happening inside your brain, inside your body, is that your amygdala, which is a small part kind of deep in the middle of your brain, is your panic center. And it's the part that's most activated in this moment. And it is actually sending neurons to shut down your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that regulates executive functioning and thinking. So basically your body is saying, we're not going to think right now. Now is the time to react. So if this happens once in a while, that's sort of okay, and that's normal. Stress is a normal part of life. But what happens when it occurs over and over again, especially if you're a child and your brain and your body are just developing, as they are in our students? So these high levels of stress and this chronic stress have significant physiological changes, including effects in brain development and immune system development and hormonal systems. And this is what it can really, feel like. Imagine how you felt in that moment of seeing the bear. For kids that are experiencing constant stress, this is something that they feel all day, every day. And these hardened and fortress-like school buildings can often reinforce those stressors and act as a constant reminder to kids that they need to stay on alert. that they aren't safe and they need, they have to be kind of on alert. And that's just not what we want, I think, for our kids. So a normal response to stress is represented by the blue line here. And it's, so you get that high spike, all those feelings that you have, the cortisol and the adrenaline. And then once you've escaped or the bears run away, you can kind of deep breath. It's gone, and it drops back down. And over time, you learn to sort of, you build resilience, right? So you begin to be able to deal with stress, and hopefully you're not encountering grizzly bears every day. Certainly in the design profession, I don't think we do, but we're encountering all kinds of stress in our life. And so you develop resilience to that, and every time you get a little bit more relaxed, you're able to maybe not spike quite as high, and just sort of recover more quickly. But if you're not adapting to this, you're under constant stress, it fails to turn off. And that's what's indicated by the red line here. And that ultimately upsets the chemical balance and can change the structure of the developing brain. So that repeated stress actually becomes a neurotoxin. It impacts brain and body development in really significant ways. And if there's nothing to tip the balance, it just continues through your life. So a resilient system, again, is able to handle that with a less severe response. So why does this matter when we're planning for school safety? Well, we feel like with any design challenge, you can't create a good solution until you really understand what you're dealing with. So I think it's important for us all to understand how the physical environment, how it looks, how it feels, as well as the policies and programs that surround that environment are impacting the kids' stress. So are they helping to build resilience and create a feeling of safety, or are they instead reinforcing that chaos that they might be experiencing in their community or in their home and putting them on hyper alert? So only when we understand this can we really provide these environments, both physically and programmatically, that help educators address these challenges effectively. We have to tip that balance to resiliency. So obviously not, we don't have 25% of our population experiencing this level of detriment in adulthood. And so what helps someone to succeed? Well, what the research tells us is that the single connecting indicator is that these kids have had at least one stable and committed relationship with an adult. And hopefully it's more, but even just one can really turn the tide for a child. And those relationships provide personalized responsiveness and protection against future negative experiences. They also can help with a child's ability to plan, to monitor and regulate their behavior, and to adapt to changing circumstances. So when we teach kids resilience, and we can do that, we strengthen their ability to thrive. So the school environment that is safe, not just from shooting incidents, but safe from all other kinds of threats. And there's, a variety, right? Schools can provide some of this scaffolding to help build resiliency by creating welcoming and connected environment, and by implementing an organized approach that helps educators prepare and identify and address issues as they arise in real time. So just to sort of summarize this first section that I've talked through, key things that we hope that you take away from this. Cognition and emotion are inextricably linked. We cannot address one without the other. We can't just talk about test scores and not deal with how kids are feeling in the building. The chronic stress is a neurotoxin, and recognizing that many of our students, many more of them than perhaps we realize or are aware of, are experiencing a significant amount of stress beyond the school building. That the school can help kids build resilience by providing positive and supportive relationships, and that policies and the buildings can contribute to that solution. So Bob, I think I'm going to pass it to you now to talk about how we go about this.
Yeah. So as Anne spoke about the science of why, we also explored the how. How are we going to address these things? And we took a look at the public health approach and specifically its relationship to violence. The public health approach had its origins in the early 19th century with visionaries like Edwin Chadwick, who discovered the relationship between public hygiene and disease control. This later developed into the science of epidemiology, and it was a really radical approach at the time. It was proactive rather than reactive. And in the last, I would say, 50 years, we've seen the principles of the public health approach applied to violence as well. One example is CPTED practices, which we'll get to in a little bit. The recognition of violence as a health issue was founded in the understanding of behavior as it relates to contextual, environmental, and social stressors. The CPTED example I described is one, for those of you that aren't familiar, CPTED stands for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And the basic tenet is that the built environment, your environment, can affect behavior. And those CPTED practices, which came about in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, are a wonderful example of that and how the environment can control behavior. The public health approach itself, as the example, has a four-step process, and this is the exact process that we've been following in our data collection, in our kind of study to get answers. And it begins with defining what the problem is, and that's gathering relevant data. That's something that we've been doing through literature and through other studies. And the second step takes us into identifying those risks, using that data to identify what those high-risk factors are, and then developing the interventions based on that data. And that's about where we are in our study, and we're hoping that even through this seminar, this webinar, that we'll be able to get some input from the audience to help inform what we're doing, and it leads to ultimately the implementation. In short, the public health approach is a systems approach. It begins before a gunman is at the door. It begins by addressing the ACEs that Anne has spoken about. It's about identifying struggling students and connecting those students to supports. We're hoping through this session that we've crafted that we're trying to bring more focus to a holistic approach, not just focusing on the physical, but on the social and emotional and the mental health, and try to keep schools welcoming, nurturing, and feeling safe, as well as being safe. Following the Parkland shooting, a multidisciplinary group of 19 researchers came together to create a call to action. Based on the public health approach, it emphasized a change in mindset from simply preparing students to the prevention itself. And there are three major tenets that came out of this call. First is a focus on school climate. And this is looking at it from a student perspective, physically and emotionally making it safe. A school environment that protects students from bullying, discrimination, and harassment. One that I would say has kind of an open and connected culture as much as it can. The second major thing is focuses on mental health. And it's school and community-based mental health services. It's also the forms of discipline, restorative justice, social and emotional learning. These all contribute as well. And finally, it included threat assessment. And this is the idea that all schools in all contexts for schools are a little bit different in that teams are needed to recognize, understand, and meet regularly to define what the highest risks are and create channels of communication and channels of preparedness for all. Before we go a little bit deeper into some of this and into the research, we do want to speak a little bit about another important element to all this, and that's fear itself.
Yeah, so depending on what data you pull, the numbers will vary, but all sources agree that school shootings are statistically very, very rare events. So why is it that we talk about them so much? Well, I think really the statistical rarity doesn't matter when the threat is our children. So it's important to sort of understand that and keep that in mind. So that statistical rarity is kind of just okay, those are numbers. But it should remind us that we do need to put things in perspective when we're thinking about spending our resources. So constant media coverage of these relatively rare incidents helps to magnify our fears about school violence and also focus on a single issue rather than the sort of broader issues that we're really needing to address. So earlier I mentioned that we felt like our communities are lacking some tangible terms, and so one, if I can get it to pop up. There we go, my mouse wasn't working. So one term we want to share is the idea of an awareness heuristic. And this is a mental bias wherein the more readily an event leaps to mind from memory, the more probable or likely we think it is to occur, regardless of facts or data. And I think it's important to understand this. You know, we're all humans. We're, many of us, parents or aunts or uncles on this call. And so we really care about our children and we want to address these issues, but it's important to not get overwhelmed by sort of the worst case scenario. So this is kind of exactly the trap that we can't fall for the sake of our kids. Decisions that are driven by fear often cause more harm than they do good, and they create exactly the kind of situations that we're trying to help avoid. So it's important to put our fear in context so that it doesn't paralyze our ability to see the whole picture and to come up with a balanced approach. So we really need to understand the difference between fear and danger. So in terms of keeping risks in perspective, I think this is really why the public health approach is useful. It's important to assess how children's ability to learn at school is impacted by potential fear and chronic stress caused by shooting incidents. And not just incidents, but also the sort of training and drills that we're doing as well to potentially prepare for this type of thing. So now's the time, you know, in planning to step back and really address the situation with a comprehensive approach, creating positive school climates where everyone feels supported and has access to tools for managing stress. And that goes not just for the kids, but for all of the adults in the schools as well. So paying too much attention to what's frightening or causing us fear and not what's actually dangerous can drain precious resources away from our solutions. So school climate and culture is a really key part of the public health approach, and these two terms are used interchangeably, but they are a little bit different. School climate refers to an individual's experience and feelings, while school culture refers to long-term physical and social environments that we develop, as well as the shared values or beliefs of the school. The National School Climate Center has proposed 13 dimensions for school climate, and they're categorized into these 6 major areas: safety, teaching and learning, interpersonal relationships, institutional environment, social media, and then leadership and professional relationships for staff. So it's important, you know, as we've said, that school safety goes beyond just physical safety. Cognition and emotion are linked, right? So these 13 dimensions acknowledge that a sense of security fosters student learning, and that interpersonal relationships between students and each other and students and staff can really affect school climate. So a student's feeling of connectedness to their school has shown both better health and academic outcomes, and also can help reduce the level of aggression in kids. A school's physical characteristics too, things like lighting, acoustics, cleanliness, how well it's maintained, all those environmental features also have a positive correlation, well, if they're positive features, have a positive correlation with academic performance. So administrators are really crucial in setting the tone for school climate with clear vision, with being accessible to their staff, and leadership and staff kind of have to come together and really work as a collective whole for this to work. So I'm not going to read through this, but we just wanted to sort of share with you some of the vast amount of research that supports the idea that a positive school climate has wonderful benefits for school systems. It affects students, staff, families, and beyond into the community as well. The benefits range everything from, you know, improved academic achievement, but also personal and mental health, relationships, reduced bullying, reduced victimization, reduce teacher turnover and dropout rates. So just a lot of really great outcomes from building a positive school climate and culture. So it's not a simple or a quick task to do that, but it's a really crucial piece of school improvement, and it can have profound effects on both student well-being and academic success, and ultimately safety. So there's a lot of programs or frameworks out there to help schools and communities deploy a public health approach. We think that this approach is really useful and really is kind of the way to go, but it's not just sort of, okay, now what do we do with it? So these programs are kind of the, how do you actually implement this? There's a lot of frameworks that exist, and these are just some of them that we heard from the rural and suburban schools that we have talked with and interviewed to date. And so a lot of schools are engaging with these structures to proactively address challenges and create positive cultures. They're kind of good go-to guides for anyone that's trying to do this. I am certainly not an expert on any of these, but I will talk a little more in detail just to share one example of the first one here, the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Support, PBIS. And this was one of the more common ones that we heard about. So as the name suggests, it uses evidence-based programs and practices to do interventions to promote and improve student behavior, academic performance, safety, and build a positive school culture. So it emphasizes preventing problem behaviors before they happen, reducing exclusionary discipline practices. This is a three-tier system. So tier 1 includes interventions for almost everyone. So again, the public health approach supports the idea of maximizing the number of people who benefit. And then as we move to 2-tier and tier 3, there are more specialized interventions or individualized interventions for learners who are more at risk, people who may have behavioral challenges, or at the tier 3 level, sort of chronic challenges or issues. So at this point, I think we've sort of established one of the most significant factors with school safety for all types of safety issues, and including shootings, is really the mental health crisis that we're facing across the country. We need to address that by thinking about the whole child as a whole person. We've talked about how the public health approach can help to solve this challenge in a systemic way. And now I think I'll pass it back to you, Bob, to share some of the specific data points from our research with the risks. And then we'll also hear from Andrea about how DC Public Schools are tackling this challenge.
Great, thanks, Ann. So yeah, we wanted to, again, this is part of our ongoing study, and what is behind some of the data is, first we had a review, combing a lot of literature that's out there, what's being said, but then looking a little bit deeper into data and statistics, and we found some wonderful studies that did a lot of the kind of comprehensive work of pulling data together. And then we supplemented that, as I had mentioned, with our own surveys and interviews, relatively small sample. We engaged a few schools in DC as well as in up here in Massachusetts, and we captured maybe good examples from suburban and rural. We're hoping to supplement that with some urban schools. But it really, what it was good for is a good check against what the data it says. And we found that there was really a lot of alignment, and we'll share some of that with you. And again, the last portion we'll get to is what do we do going forward. So first, we'll start off with, the most horrific thing you can imagine, which are the fatalities in schools, and trying to understand, well, where are the real risks, what's really happening. This represents a summary of data that was put together by Safe Havens International. I think it was over about a 12-year stretch, and it pulled together a number of resources to look at fatalities that are related to schools. And what we found, and may surprise some, is that transportation-related fatalities is number one overall. So for as much attention as we hear about many horrific events that happen in schools, if we're really concerned about focusing on safety and saving lives, this would be the number one thing that we would focus on. I think you can see that although it represents the largest piece of the pie, so to speak. If you look off to the left, there's a chart that shows, it puts transportation fatalities in perspective. If you look at total fatalities versus those that happen in schools, schools are still a really small percentage. So it's not to say that our school sites or access to school is a problem. But again, if you were to just look at school safety itself and fatalities, that would be where you would focus. What we found was second are homicides, and that's about 1/3 of the pie overall. And by homicides, what we're talking about is not necessarily gun-related, weapons-related, but interpersonal. So this would include robberies or gang-related incidents, and it is a pretty large portion. If we look off to the chart on the left, again, if we think about where these types of incidences are happening, you'll see that way down at the bottom is that the little sliver of schools, a very small total of what you would see in a lot of other places, places you visit, public buildings or homes and garages and on streets. So it's not to say that, this is really an enormous problem in schools, but again, it's probably certainly worthy of attention. What you'll notice here is that active shooter fatalities are the 3rd lowest overall. They're only higher than severe winds or outright accidents. So this helps kind of put some things in perspective about, it's not to take away at all from the horrific events of shootings and the vulnerability we feel, but certainly when we talk about actual safety and saving lives, it would suggest that the focus may need to go in several different places. Following up on this is some information that was put together in 2017 by the Center for Disease Control, and this is a study on youth risk behavior. So this was a survey, and what you can see here overall among these categories that range from drug use and weapons to bullying and sexual violence, as well as just feelings of sadness and those related to suicide or attempting suicide. What stands out most are the mental health side. So the feelings of sadness, hopelessness, suicide are certainly very high overall on this graph. In the middle, you can see that bullying also is quite a large amount, particularly if you put the two of them, you stack them together. What we're seeing there in blue are social media, and then in the green is just being bullied at school itself. So I think this information, sort of tells us where some of the risks are. If you look again further to the left and we look at weapons, that again is relatively low. Still an issue, but in the scheme of things, there seems to be a lot more risk associated with the mental health side, as well as bullying certainly comes up as substantial. So we also, this is some of our survey work, and again, it's a sample of schools, and what this chart is showing, the darker colors represent people's or staff's number one choice or their choice, whether it was number 1 or 2, and it goes lighter as you get to something that was maybe their 10th or 11th choice. And so in aggregate, you can see sort of the darker colors in the bigger span of, in that first bar, for example, 40 votes that say the number 1 concern is mental health. You can see where it's weighted pretty substantially. So among the schools that we checked in with, this aligns closely with what we saw in that CDC study. We see that mental health issues were identified as the number 1 risk, and this is by a margin of 5 times any other on this graph. We also see that bullying shows up as a substantial concern. It's again, you could put those two together and suggest that maybe that is even the greater concern overall, but certainly in line with what we saw in that previous graph. Substance abuse was one that we found a little bit different. It was a close number 4, but in the small sample of rural schools, it actually was more prevalent, moved even ahead of bullying as a higher risk and higher concern. So we also asked, with bullying and even the mental health concerns, how are these known? How are schools identifying students or observing this? You can't address it if you don't know how often it's happening. And there are some blurry lines in understanding what actually defines bullying. You can see here, and I think generally the schools were in relative agreement with what 2017 NCES indicator of bullying and where the places that it occurred. Not surprisingly, hallways and stairwells, was a pretty popular location for that. But surprising to me anyway was that so much of it happening inside a classroom itself. And then there are some other areas that you might expect it in a cafeteria or outside on the school grounds. But in understanding how these issues are known, they're certainly reported to counselors or teachers. And that type of reporting requires a good rapport, a good culture, one that's open and students feel comfortable going to the staff and the counselors to express these things or share these things that are happening. We also know that in many of the schools they talk about ambassador or mentor programmings. They have many of them have peer groups. So rather than going even directly to a teacher or an advisor, there are a group of students that take on that communication channel and not only work to kind of help hear and mitigate and be ears to the ground, but also being part of the solution, coming up with ways to pull people together and inform each other on things, tolerance, and just acting more as one. We also heard that the planned daily observations were a big part of what the faculty and staff felt were important. And this is just kind of keeping a check, keeping an eye on the students. It could be at arrival, but those things certainly are helpful and very informative. Routine surveys were something that was also floated out, and I think when we get later into this presentation, Ann will share a really good example of one we heard in an elementary school that just seemed so effective, so simple, and not obvious to the student that they're being surveyed on how they're relating to other students. So what defines bullying? One of the things we heard pretty consistently from among the schools is that they really try to separate it from meanness and from quarrels. That's going to happen. But it's really when it follows a pattern, when it's repeated, and often there is a power imbalance. That's where they're defining it as effectively as bullying. So we also asked the schools, what are they doing? What are the primary things they're doing for safety and security and to address all these risks, all these concerns? And many of them that we heard about were the fairly obvious ones. They've got locked exterior doors, trying to minimize the number of entries or the access into the building. They're certainly practicing drills. We heard about 2 to 4 times a year. But often it's only the basics. It's a fire drill or it's a lockdown drill. And what we're hearing from safety professionals is that there's a lot more that really should be done, including reverse evacuation and other types of things. Interestingly, we also asked how these drills impact the students. And overall, for the most part, again, small sample, but it didn't seem like it was a major impact with the exception of if a student may have been caught alone or in isolation, say in a restroom when a drill occurred, that really, or a student that was prone to anxiety, it seemed to really have, much more of an impact, obviously, on those individuals or those situations. We also know surveillance is a big part of it, and although you could say a lot of this is after the fact, the schools pointed to the presence of surveillance cameras as actually being a way to control behavior a bit. But certainly it's important to find out the truth. One school reported how there's such a gray line between things that occur like bullying, and so the tail of the tape can certainly be useful for them to get to the truth. And then school resource officers, we heard that they are in some of the schools that we surveyed, and in all cases where they had a school resource officer, they were seen as a real asset, that there was a real bond between the student body and the resource officer. But we also heard is that the schools felt, well, maybe they got lucky because they don't pick their school resource officer. They're assigned to the school. And these schools happen to have great individuals that became almost an additional counselor to the students, someone very trusted, very engaged. And that's an example of where it's working. We know nationally there's more mixed results on the presence of resource officers and too much of that must really comes down to the individuals that are involved and/or the training that's involved. So some of what we heard that was maybe a little bit different than expected were things like mental health therapists. And all schools have a variety of therapists and counselors, and a good practice ratio is about 1 to 250, but what we saw in these schools is a ratio of about 1 to 100, which was wonderful. And we also heard about specialty programs that they conduct. Some of them are morning meeting with large groups or as much of the student body as they can. The ambassador programs or mentor programs that I talked about, but also teaching mindfulness, yoga, working that into the curriculum. Calmer choice type of programs, PBIS or the MTTS that Ann had described a bit, are all an important part. We also know the threat assessment teams are vital, and our point on this would be that they really need to be inclusive. When we think about if site safety is really paramount and where there's a number of fatalities, you would certainly hope that transportation individuals are involved in that threat assessment team for each district. And for that matter, kitchen custodial staff as well. And then finally, one that really seemed to have a powerful impact was the act of greeting and observation. So in this case, despite the very large schools, most of the schools really have an effort to get the principals, to get key staff members out, greeting the students as they come in the day, at least having an eye on them, making themselves available and approachable. And those things seem to be really important. They can kind of pick out the students that are having a bad day or someone that isn't wearing a jacket or whatever it might be, whatever indicator. Those things build up over time and kind of help paint a picture. But all of them describe this as a pretty powerful tool. And so this is a little bit of what we learned from our sample, and we have the benefit of Andrea here, who can share a little bit of what she sees in the DC public school system.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, this is great. I think Ann and Bob really laid it out for us. And I wanted to share sort of a perspective specifically from DCPS of how we're really thinking about safety and security and just the overall health and wellness of our students. It certainly is a complex challenge, and one size doesn't fit all. Just to sort of frame it for you, I oversee facilities for all 117 facilities within DCPS. We're obviously a very urban school district, and I'll sort of even talk about some of those challenges, but facilities itself actually falls under the Chief Operating Officer. And I think it's sort of important to note that even what was outlined before, I don't make a decision on an hour or a daily basis that doesn't impact another team member that I work closely with. So I sort of outlined those at the top. It's our strategic school operations, school security, food and nutrition, compliance and policy, and attendance. And I'm really collaborating with those folks. We each play a different role in the overall health and wellness and safety of the students. For instance, I'm having constant communication with food and nutrition, who receive regular deliveries, which are an essential operation of our schools, but we are always having the conversation of where should deliveries be dropped off? Do we want another entrance where someone is coming in and out, and who's controlling that, and who's walking away from it, and is it an AI phone, and can we buzz them in? Like down to every little detail. Certainly we need to provide lunch and breakfast and receive those deliveries. So what does that really look like and mean for us? And I'm going to walk you guys through 3 different case studies. We're going to look at an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school for us, and sort of how we have tackled thinking about the safety and wellness of our students. But here on the summary slide, I've just started with a couple of sort of key things that we think about on all of our schools. Both Bob and Ann talked about perimeter and access, and hopefully everyone across the country, has secure access. But for us, we really started to think about where are students and staff going in and out, and where we're down to the sort of point of where are card readers located. Because what we were finding is that, yes, we want to have one main entrance and one primary point, but by human nature, people will take the easiest point of access. So if we don't provide a card reader for teachers to get back in when they've taken their students out on a walk or out to the playground or out to do some other outdoor activity, they will prop open the door, which creates a security breach for us. And so we're really thinking about down to that level of where do those card readers want to go. We're thinking about lockdown hardware on all regularly occupied student spaces. So that could be classrooms, it could be resource rooms, anywhere that a student really occupies. Access to healthy food options. We actually, as a school district, serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner at almost every school. And so not only are we just providing sort of the routine lunch that a typical school would, we're really thinking about students are coming at 7:30 in the morning to get access to breakfast. And what does that mean from a safety perspective? Where are they entering? Who's supervising them? And down to dinner being served at 5 o'clock before our aftercare usually ends around 6. Thinking about bullying is a really big and important topic for us. Some sort of smaller interventions that we've made, we've moved away from providing sort of the closed restroom doors because we were finding that a lot of bullying is taking place in the restroom and other sort of closed off areas. So this is an example here at an elementary school for us that just opened, where we certainly want to maintain the privacy and the views, but we can sort of actively hear what's going on, and students are less likely to sort of hang out in there. We've actually started pulling out all of the sinks and hand washing stations as well. And then down to what does the front door look like? We do provide X-ray and metal detectors that our middle school and high school students do walk through every day when they enter school, but does that need to be the first thing that they see when they walk in that door? I'm going to actually share a case study of Banneker High School that's under construction, and we had a lot of conversations about that where, you know, we still are, as a school district, need to provide those elements, but again, they don't need to be the first thing that the students see. So I'm going to take us to Kimball Elementary School. Elementary school for us in the district actually starts at 3-year-olds. So we're really thinking of what is a really tiny little 3-year-old experience as they walk up to the front of the school, up to a 5th grader. Our middle school then starts at 6th grade, that's 6th to 8th, and then high school is the traditional 9th to 12th. So Kimball actually opened for us this school year. During the design process, it's in a really underserved area where crime is really high, and primarily when we did all of our community engagement process, they really weren't interested in what's the material or what does it look like. They just asked over and over and over again, will it be safe? Where will my child enter the building? What will it feel like when they're in the inside? Like that was 100% their primary concern. And so the design team did a fantastic job and really thought about a number of different critical elements. So we found out that a lot of the older siblings of the students will drop off and then walk down the street to about 2 blocks away, a middle school of ours. And so we were thinking about, we do want a single entrance, and there's an image in the upper left that shows the double-sided entrance, but people were really coming off the main Minnesota Avenue and the back side. So we have a security guard that can sit there and allow people to come from either direction and has great visibility and can buzz people in, and it accommodated sort of all paths of travel. As a school district, we don't provide busing. We only have small buses for special education, so students primarily walk or bike to school. Certainly some get dropped off, but we try to sort of discourage that. We don't provide lay-by lanes or drop-off dedicated to vehicular. It's really meant to be an urban school district. So that in mind, what does that pedestrian path look like where students parking their bicycles and scooters as they approach school? And then I think Anne even mentioned, really thinking about access to nature and biophilic and just the overall wellness of the student. So for Kimball in particular, we honestly can't control what happens at home. They certainly live in tough neighborhoods, but we can control what happens at school and on the inside. And so from the very beginning, the design revolved around the safe interior courtyard that you can see in the bottom left. We really wanted to provide sort of a retreat, a place where students felt safe at all moments, where they could go out there, get fresh air, run around. But providing access to our playgrounds is a really essential component for us. We want to always make sure that that's open to the public. So we strategically chose not to actually put the playgrounds themselves inside the courtyard, and those are outside in sort of the light yellow spaces in the overall sort of aerial and bird's eye view so that they do remain public, but we can provide this oasis in the courtyard to the students as sort of a relaxation. And as a part of the design, Biophilic was a very intentional aspect throughout. And Anne even mentioned, having that mentor, having that one person can really matter to those students. And for this school in particular, the librarian jumps out at me. She was a really active member and participant throughout the process. And she was really given about 600, 700 square feet classroom to run her library previously. And we gave her, just as part of our traditional ed spec, over 2,500 square feet. And it has a beautiful view out to parkland. You can see the trees in the background in the upper right, and just the overall feeling that it has for the students as they walk in. Obviously, our goal is to really make them feel safe and at home when they're at school. So next I wanted to take you to Elliott Hine Middle School. This is a middle school that is under construction for us and will open this coming August. And I wanted to talk about a couple key things that came to light as we started this project. So the upper left-hand corner is the existing floor plan. And you can sort of see the light green area. It ends up being the historic portion that we kept as part of the project. And the sort of black and white hashed area was a 1960s addition that quite honestly just created a lot of safety problems for the school. You can sort of see that they're dead-end wings that students would go to. Middle school do transverse between classes, but yet they're still 6th graders and 7th graders, and they're still quite young and not mature enough. And so they would walk into spaces that they shouldn't be. We were sort of having trouble keeping track of them and creating unsafe spaces. So a big move, a part of the project, is we actually demoed those 3-story wings off the back. And you can see the left-hand proposed plan where the design team built an addition and really created this connection. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a fluid, there were no more dead ends, and it was really safe and easier for the school administration to monitor. If anyone that works in K-12 or is part of a school system, I feel strongly that middle school is quite honestly the toughest age group to design for. They're no longer sort of that innocence of the elementary, but they don't quite have the maturity of the high school students yet, and we see a lot of abuse that our buildings take in the middle school grades. So being able to provide that passive supervision while still letting them sort of grow and adapt and transition into that high school phase, I think this new design where we created better connection allowed for that. And then the other complex challenge for us, and Anne touched on this, is the community connectivity. So Constitution Avenue is along the south end of the site, and C Street is along the north end. And the building really felt like it sort of had a back to C Street, but a lot of community members access the building from C Street. It's a very present street that takes you in and out of the city, and we wanted to create more of a connection to the community. The front is a very historic front that we couldn't really change a whole lot, so we wanted to rethink what the quote-unquote back of the building looked like. And you can see those images in the upper right-hand corner where we have a new community entrance that takes you in to this really beautiful cafeteria, an overflow and common space that we'll be able to use. And hopefully, like a lot of school districts, our buildings are not just used from 8 to 3 during the school hours. They are open till 6, 8 o'clock at night, if not later, and then on the weekends. And so we're always finding creative ways to sort of section off maybe the academic wings, but allow some of the public space to be used. And then so one of the last features I wanted to touch on, this project in particular has gone through a number of iterations of site design, and for folks that maybe work more in the suburban or rural, this might not be as challenging for you, but for us in an urban school district, having any type of site is a luxury. We honestly in a middle school, high school don't always get the ability to have field space, and it's not uncommon for our students to be traveling across the city to access fields for games and or practices. But a big part of what the community was looking for kind of goes back to some of the slides that were previously touched on about transportation, and they really wanted to be able to host soccer and middle school baseball. And we were running into a number of different challenges, needing bioretention and parking, but ultimately we were able to land on a scheme that we can host the baseball and the soccer, and really excited to move forward with that because it does limit the students transporting, whether that's via metro or public transportation, across the city to another field in order to accommodate that. And then the last case study I wanted to share with you is Banneker High School. This is a citywide high school for us. So it's an application high school where students are coming from all 8 wards that they apply to. It is also in construction and will open in about 16, 17 months for us. And then one of the interesting things for me when we sort of kicked this project off, we were working closely, not even just with the teams within the Chief Operating Officer, but also our health services team who oversees our clinic and some of our mental health services, shared with us that it is the highest achieving high school for us in the city. And sort of with that, as you can imagine, comes a great level of stress for some of these students. Their parents may or may not have even graduated from high school, probably have not gone on to college, and this is really their like sort of first opportunity, and there's a lot of added pressure for the students to succeed. And unfortunately, as a result of that, Banneker has one of the highest attempted suicide rates of all of our schools. So the design team did a really fantastic job of sort of taking that knowledge and thinking about the mental health aspect of our students. We actually held design charrettes with the students, specifically targeted around mental health and what does that mean. So a number of different things that went into the approach of the design, again, focused around mental health, were what is that front entrance like? This is actually a brand new construction for us, and their current facility, we're actually relocating them, is in a historic building. While although beautiful, certainly has a more solidness to it. It's solid brick in the front. The doors are no glass at the front, not incredibly welcoming, and that was really something we were interested in. You can see the main entrance rendering up in the top right. This will be sort of the first view as students walk up to the school, and the goal is really to make it as welcoming as we can. The students here, far more than probably any school I have been to within our own school district, just live and breathe at this school. At 3 o'clock, 3:30 when that bell rings, they go straight up to, they refer to as the Learning Commons or their library, and they're there till 5 or 6 o'clock studying, working on different academics. And the principal, welcomes that. She does not encourage students to go home. She really encourages them to stay and work together. So the middle image in the rendering was this great idea that the design team brought to us, where instead of sort of making the library its own sort of private and separate space, what if we made, and again the school refers to it as their Learning Commons, cascade across these 4 floors. And there's a diagram with the red sort of arrows. The building is 4 stories, and it literally occupies the middle of the building and sort of putting learning on display. Again, encouraging folks to find that quiet retreat, to take the time that they need for the overall mental and health and social well-being. And then one of the last aspects I think is really great, and I'm really excited for the students to be able to use it, is sort of some of the exterior spaces. So in the site plan off to the left, you can see something called the quad, or it's right outside the cafeteria, and it's another retreat space for the students. We also have rooftops that you can actually see the Washington Monument from it as well. Thank you. I forgot that I can do the arrow. Here is the quad in the outdoor space. Again, giving the students another opportunity for a retreat from sort of a mental health perspective. So hopefully those are some intriguing case studies for you across sort of every grade that we cover. It's certainly a different approach. Perimeter access and all the things I touched on are part of these projects too, but I want to sort of point out some different features across the 3 schools.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that ties in exactly with our last segment, and I know we're probably running a little bit over, so we're going to do this last segment a little bit rapid fire, I think, because we did want to get to the questions that are being posed. But Andrea's showing a lot of great examples, and you'll see there might be some redundancy in this last section. What we really want to focus on, and we're still working on this, is a balanced approach forward. And the way we've done this or approached it is to break it into 5, for lack of a better word, buckets. 5 categories that we think warrant attention, at a very equal or similar level. And we'll just step through these relatively quickly. Starting with addressing transportation safety, I think, based on statistics and some of the information that we've seen, how can we not focus on this as a significant element of school safety. I know when we approach every project, designers are looking for ways to make schools more walkable, or in an urban, not all settings are the same. Certainly if they're vehicular traffic, to try to separate cars and buses. But we also know, aside from what we do as designers, there are things that the district can do and the community can do as well. So for each one of these categories, you'll see we've got district, designer, and community. And in this case, we know things like, that the district can do are basically inclusion of the transportation folks in the threat assessment teams would be a big thing. We know as communities, they can get involved organizing safe routes or organizing walking buses, which I think we also have some examples of here.
So in the interest of time, I'll probably focus on just one sort of, I think what's fun and unique for us is something called a traffic garden. So since I mentioned we don't actually provide busing, we really encourage our students to bike. And so as part of our PE and health program, we actually formalized a curriculum to teach students to bike. So we provide balanced bikes at the pre-K 3 and 4 level at every single elementary school, and then provide a set of up to 25 for an entire class bikes at second grade. So in second grade, they're learning to ride full-on bikes if they don't know already. And when we go in to modernize either a full school or we do a lot of just playground and site replacements, we are incorporating what we refer to as a traffic garden. So you can see that in the upper left-hand corner. Those are two different projects we actually completed this summer. And it can be done in a number of really simple or different ways. It could be on the surfacing and painted and stripes, but it teaches them to sort of ride in modified, quote unquote, like city streets or bike lanes, learning to stop. They'll put up different stop signs with the PE teacher, learning different traffic signals, the appropriate way to cross the street. And I think as my role within facilities is us, making sure that we're designing and working with our design teams to incorporate that so that the schools can use it to teach the students.
So the second one here is creating a positive and connected school culture. And again, I'm not going to read through each of these, but some things that the district, the designer, and the community can do on this. This is where transparency and visibility really come to be pretty important. So there's a number of ways that educators and leadership can create these connected cultures. But also architecturally, we can support this by interweaving sort of informal learning spaces, increasing visibility through the careful placement and use of glass inside the buildings. And so in conversations with schools, these informal spaces, I'm actually going to go ahead to the next slide here because we have an example. This is Essex Tech High School in Massachusetts. The use of this sort of informal space, we heard a lot from the schools that we talked with, that these are really highly used and that they are not only great for sort of academic engagement, but they really create a sense of connectivity in sort of personal connections through the school with. So here you can see, the classroom sort of surrounding it and each having I don't know if I can, for some reason I can't get the pointer to point where I want it to. But there's glass between each of those spaces, and then you see also sort of to the left in that image, even teacher workspace spaces that look out into that, not only to supervise it, but also, again, creating that visibility for students. So it just makes everyone feel a little bit more comfortable with each other and know what everyone is doing and what everyone is working on. And then, Andrea, I think you have a couple things here.
Yeah, I just wanted to share if you go back one, and the image to the left. We actually, as part of our construction projects, apply a certain percentage, up to about $500,000 in public art. And it honestly adds a really fantastic layer and element in school culture to every single one of our schools, both supporting local artists as well as sort of incorporating the history of the school into the design.
Yeah, and then I'll just be super quick here. I think we kind of mentioned this before, but welcoming students at the door has a really significant impact. And also thinking about, Andrea talked about, elementary, middle, and high school and sort of some of the differences there. One thing that we found in the research is that for the younger kids, the student-to-adult ratio is, student-to-adult relationship is really important. Whereas when you get up to the upper grades and in high school, that peer-to-peer relationship is really important. So finding places that students can hang out and participate in positive activities together. I think this is me too. So mental health support and awareness, I think this is really tied closely to the last one. Again, providing counselor ratios is a really big one, and I think we were fortunate to talk to a lot of schools, the schools that had really great ratios, but the reality is that nationwide, 1.7 million kids actually attend schools that have no counselors but do have police officers. So just the schools we talked to, have a nice ratio, but that is not consistent across the country, and I think is an issue that just as members of our community, as parents, as folks participating civically, that we should really be trying to address and talking about, pushing our leadership at the political level to try to address that and provide funding, because usually the answer as to why they don't have it is funding. So really thinking about that on that level. Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, and I mentioned, the biophilic design of the library in Kimball previously, but the lower left is Bancroft that opened for us about 1.5 years ago. We always see schools, really trying to provide yoga classes. I've been in a number of schools where we use peace rooms or really relaxation rooms, anything where there's so much stress and pressure for these students to succeed, where they can find their moment, they can step away if they're having any high anxiety and find that sort of quiet and retreat space.
And I'll just go through the last few really quick. It's almost ironic because this number 4 is what many people might even consider like virtually all of safety and security. So, it's about the physical design, both active and passive things that you build into a school. Certainly we would say, we think this needs a lot of focus, but we have it as one of 5 buckets, and there's a lot here. This is a large one. We certainly encourage CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, concepts be applied to schools, and that's a lot of really into the planning, just the natural visibility, defining the perimeter of the school and the thresholds onto school property. Certainly access control is a big part of that, and maintenance as well. A well cared for building goes a long way for safety and security and to keep kind of a culture and a pride going. The majority of this, of course, is for the designer, but we do see that there are some things the district and community can do. And some examples include just a secured vestibule, which we know have evolved quite a bit in the recent years to control access. We know having layers of lock-off in a school and good visibility. I see there are some questions about glass that I hope to get to. In the bottom left, you can provide good visibility out into corridors, into shared space, but also natural get-out-of-sight spaces at the same time within classrooms, which we think is a good thing to provide. And the last one is really about policy, and no surprise, this is really primarily on the district, but even the safest school with the most stringent measures for safety and security would be rendered vulnerable if policies aren't in place, if policies aren't followed. As Andrea had mentioned, if a door is pegged open and teachers aren't abiding by protocols, it can render the entire school effectively weak. And policy goes into a lot of things, including the threat assessment teams that we've been talking about, and the drills and the rehearsal. And we've got a few examples here, but if I can, I think we just ended at 1:15. I don't know if people can stay on, but I will just quickly answer a couple of the questions that I see here. One, I'll take them out of order, but Rob Pillar is asking about the updated information from Safe Havens. We showed you a lot of statistics, and yes, that Safe Havens had put together about 12 years, actually 14 years worth of data and it's a little bit dusty. I understand from talking to Mike Dorn that he is continuing and actually is almost ready to release an update. Has not released it yet, but in working regularly with him, he's said pretty much everything remains in line with what they had seen previously. So we're looking forward to getting updated data very much. We also have, I'll let the team weigh in on this too, but a lot of questions about glass and what research shows that if glass can still improve safety for children in schools. And we would say absolutely. I think a lot of what we're talking about here are all threats. And what's more prevalent than, say, a shooter or an incident like that would be bullying, would be sexual assault. So as much as there may be an inclination or a lean towards sealing everything up, making things not visible and locking doors, that's really not the thing we need to do. Students feel safer when they feel connected. Students are safer when there's visibility and accountability. And as Andrea had mentioned, what we're seeing in schools, that's not just visual, that's acoustic as well. So what we call airport-style bathrooms, where the bathrooms are open and acoustically teachers and whoever's inside, those restrooms, there's still a connection there. Stairwells where doors can be left open are important. Natural lines of sight. You really want to create a school that is culturally connected, and that includes that visibility, those connections to others and to what's happening throughout the school, what's happening in the corridors. But I would say controlled visibility is certainly key. I don't know if the team wants to weigh in on those, and Matt, if you can tell us what we do with a little bit of run over in time. Are we allowed to continue?
Yeah, for anyone who does need to drop off, you can feel free. You've definitely earned your credit at this point. We're happy to go. We can go another, 5-10 minutes to go over these final questions. If everyone is agreeable to that, that's okay.
That'd be great.
Yeah,
I'd love to chime in on the interior glass from the school district perspective.
Yeah,
we have a lot of those conversations, actually even recently, and from our perspective, we do like it, and we want to encourage our design teams. We certainly have to work with our school administration and our teachers. I can think of a particular school that actually opened for us this fall where there was a lot of glass between the classrooms and the corridors. And oftentimes, when teachers are moving back in, it's so drastically different from what they were used to in their previous school, or maybe they had a little sort of half light in their old classroom door, and that was it, that it takes sort of a bit of a shock effect for them to get used to. We often get asked for blinds, and even to that effect, we've taken a fairly hard stance of not providing blinds because there are so many other safety concerns that bullying and the sexual assault that could happen in those classrooms that actually happen more than the active shooter. And so providing that glass gives us that sense of visibility and protection. Now, that being said, we actually have a full team that does our emergency preparedness. So I'm in constant sort of communication with them that when we are providing this glass, how do teachers who are responsible for those students during those drills and moment really provide a safe space inside the classrooms, and how do they maybe hide behind any shelving or other items within the classroom to still sort of meet and mandate any of those practice drills. So I think it's an ever-evolving. We really prefer to see glass and give that visibility.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
I think there's also a question here about parent support and involvement, and I think the answer is that that's also really important. I think, parents and families and everyone in the community really does have a role to play in this. I think when our team started the research, we felt a lot like the media was saying architects have to solve this problem by building fortresses, and I think what we're trying to say is that's not really the answer. And so parent support and parent involvement is great, and I think it's also important to realize in many families that that's not always possible, or that parents may want to be involved, but they don't necessarily have the resources or the time. to do that. And Andrea, maybe you can speak to some of the things I know DCPS provides in some of the schools, parent support spaces and other sort of family support spaces that can help parents to become more involved and also learn some stuff themselves.
Yeah, and all of our Title I schools, which is really a big percentage for us, we provide parent resource centers, which could be as simple as, it can have a washer and dryer in it. It could have tables and chairs to just sort of have meetings, access to technology, providing some desktops, since not all of our families have access to technology. A couple other things I was just going to quickly mention on top of that. We provide something, it's a national survey that different school districts use called a Panorama survey. It really gets at, how do teachers, students, and families feel when they're in the school. It's asking a lot of sort of health and well-being questions, and it's a great tool as a school district for us to capture those results for individuals and really learn from that of what is the overall experience and sort of takeaway from each of the schools. And then another partner that we have is called Gaggle, and I would encourage folks to sort of look at that. It's a proactive approach to suicide prevention. So we partner with them, and they really provide early warning against violent threats. So they're monitoring documents and emails, and then we go back and work with the school administration or the healthcare nurses or social workers, and certainly I think that is when parents get involved. And then I think parents for us also certainly get involved with our SROs, as well as you can imagine, as an urban school district, we have quite a bit of gang violence, and we're always trying to track that in ways to encourage students and support them in any way that they need.
Great. So Brian's asking a question. He's experiencing a lot of resistance proposing glass, even when talking about safety and security, and asking if we've been experiencing the same or what kind of strategies maybe we've used. I can only say that it's we certainly try to have a conversation over a period of workshops to talk about safety and security. And I think when we've been successful when we expand that conversation to share some of the information that we have here of really what's more prevalent, what are the concerns or risks that are most likely to happen. And I think we've got a number of examples now of schools built with a fair amount of glass. I think some of the art is in how it's used so that you can have natural visibility or control of visibility. So having still a place where students can get out of sight in a room without having to pull a shade, I think is a critical part of that. But some of the examples that we've built in talking to the teachers and the leadership in those schools have also been instrumental in helping others feel comfortable. But I think a lot of it is the comprehensive conversation about safety. That's where it starts. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We had really hoped to get a little bit more input. I don't know if there's any way that follow-up can occur if anything stays open that allows input to continue, but we would love to hear other people's suggestions on things that we can do as designers, as districts, and as communities within each one of those categories, because it's certainly a body of work that we're continuing to work on, continuing to build and learn as we go. But we appreciate very much everyone's input.
Okay, and what I can do, guys, is export the questions that have come in, and any of these last ones that haven't been able to address yet. I can send those over to the panel so that they could be followed up with. That's not a problem. But yeah, I think since we've gone over now, I think we do need to wrap up. Do you guys have any final thoughts there before we go?
No, I would say stay tuned.
Hanging out.
Yeah,
okay.
We actually had everyone stick around for quite a long time, so that's great.
Okay, everyone. Well, I mean, this Presentation was fantastic. I want to thank our speakers for sharing their expertise with us today and all of our registrants for attending today's program. You're going to get a certificate of attendance and evaluation form via email within the next 24 hours, and we ask you take a few moments to provide us with your thoughts on the program. If you're watching the on-demand recording later, just hit the complete button at the top of the screen to take that evaluation and get your CE certificate. You can get registered for all our upcoming live webinars as well as on-demand recordings of previous events at education.a4le.org. Thanks again for joining us, and everybody have a great day.